Thank you everyone for coming this evening and afternoon to the Australian Taxpayers Alliance event following the HR Legal Society. For those of you who have been here for both HRN and ATA, I hope you've had a productive and enjoyable weekend. We specifically created this afternoon session to try and discuss, from a more pragmatic perspective, some of the issues and challenges facing Australia. I hope you found it worthwhile, and I know it's a bit of a departure from the usual fire and brimstone we have at our events. But we discussed at today's event the current state of Australian politics and realistic policy proposals, and thank you to everyone who contributed. But in my address tonight, I want to delve deeper, not into just politics, but into core issues and what I consider the failure of our side of politics. And our failure and why we are losing, for which I argue we only have ourselves to blame. Because liberty and our beliefs are in retreat, not just in Australia, but around the world. We don't only see this with rising governments, in the size of governments, but we see the rise of long discredited ideologies. We see the rise in not just protectionism, but also nationalism, and in Europe, the scary face of genuine communism and fascism. Where did we go wrong? So that's going to be the topic of my speech today, and I do want to make one note. However, usually at a function, it's considered rude to leave during a speech to get a drink. Because this is an ATA function, I will consider it a personal insult if people don't go halfway through my speech to refill their glasses. So please be courteous and refill your glasses throughout my...
Seriously, pressures us to drink in the office.
Anyway. So it's definitely a time which causes concern for all of us. As I said, liberty is in retreat, it seems, everywhere. Before I go into what I consider the reasons for this, and what we should do about it, let's have some context. First, let us look around the world, and let us look at the good news. Poverty has declined rapidly over the last 30 years around the world. In China alone, market reforms have led to 680 million people being lifted out of poverty in the last 30 years. 680 million people lifted out of poverty. 28% of China was under $1.25 a day in 1980. It's now less than 0.5%. Around the world, extreme poverty fell from 38% to 13% between 1990 and 2012. Despite the world's population growing by 2 billion, there are over 1 billion fewer poor people. In just 26 years, extreme poverty has reduced from over 1 in 3 to under 1 in 10 of the world's population. I mean, from a third to 10% in just 26 years. Even for those of us in developed countries, living standards have gone up. We look at the price of consumer goods. You know, TV, to get a TV used to be 60 hours, work hours. Now it's 6. To buy something like a washing machine used to take, 30 years ago, 67 hours. Now it's 3. Look at the advances technology has given us. Look at what the market has done. The fall of the Berlin Wall, which liberated hundreds of millions of people. These events aren't just recent, though. The prosperity that the free market has brought has been the real hockey stick. In terms of, not the fake hockey stick that is used by people wanting big government in terms of climate, that the real hockey stick has been, for pretty much all of human history up until 200 years ago, people were on $3 a day. And then you saw whoosh, this great upswing. Global life expectancy has gone from 26 to 71. The poorest people in Australia now can eat better than European royalty from the past. So why? Well, this has occurred pretty much because of everything that we believe in. Small government, individual freedom, trade, capitalism, it works. But capitalism is a misnomer to what I would say would be simple liberalism, as it was called until about 100 years ago. The signature idea of Western civilization. Sure, hints and suggestions of the liberal idea can be found in other great cultures, but it was the distinctive society produced in Europe and in the outposts of Europe, particularly in British colonies, and then in the United States, that served as the seedbed of liberalism. By the Middle Ages, many parts of Europe, and especially the West, had developed a culture friendly to private property rights and trade. You had scholastic Catholic theologians arguing for the theological basis for their liberal model on the relationship between man and the state. John Locke, then in the Scottish Enlightenment, drew on the tradition of natural law, arguing that every man is innately endowed with natural rights. What were these rights? These are rights as to what we believe in as property, your life, your liberty, or estates, or material goods, as we would now say. Economic freedom was what caused this prosperity. But economic freedom caused more than prosperity. It created human rights. It created freedom. It created all of these things which derive from it. From the increase in women's rights to the increase in things on the material plane and life expectancy. The Lockean philosophy exerted influence in England, particularly for generations to come. Everything that we now come to take for granted, which is now starting to be chipped away. The jury system, innocent until proven guilty, the rule of law, free markets, representative government, habeas corpus, free contract. These weren't the historical norm if you go through history. If you go through history and you read the morality in Homer, in the Odyssey, in the Iliad of might makes right, this was a very different morality to what we have now. All of them many of them at least, find their modern origins in England, and which they spread to America, to Australia, and to the rest of the world. One of the interesting things looking at England, and I stress this because of its particular relationship with Australia, is when you read books going back generations, you actually watch movies, there was a specific sense of freedom, which was what being an Englishman was all about. And we had this in Australia. If you read the first page of A.J.P. Taylor's Britain Between the Wars, he starts with the sentence, "Until August 1914, a sensible law-abiding Englishman could pass through life and hardly notice the existence of the state, beyond the post office and the police." I won't go into the rest of the quote, but read that first page. Unless someone asks me in Q&A, and I'll read the whole first page out for you. But this was the culture 100 years ago. And as I said, this was more than economic growth. Self-control and individual liberty offered a life of freedom and responsibility. It enabled us to realise our human dignity in peace, but in harmony with others. It was a life which was worthy of being a human being, because that was what freedom was about. It was the foundation of progress and for prosperity. It has now been replaced by state control, which offers a life of obedience, subservience, and fear. Free people are not subservient, but neither are they uncontrolled. And this is an important thing to note. Free people control themselves. So this pride and accomplishment, this can-do spirit, this dignity and self-respect, this was all part of the Australian culture. The loss of autonomy, the loss of responsibility that comes with government ownership, government oversight, government control that we see at its ultimate in the nanny state policies that try and micromanage our lives, is ultimately destructive to the human spirit. And it's bad for our communities. Peter Costello, about 15 years ago, delivered a lecture in which he gave an anecdote that has stuck with me these entire times. He spoke about community halls in rural Australia. And what he said was that back in the 50s, 60s, from the birth of Australia through to the 60s and 70s, you had, a country community would get together, fundraise, have sales, and would build a community hall, which would be the centre point of their country town. Under Whitlam, and I think Peter Costello's quote was, under some Whitlam scheme or another, which I thought was quite funny, they decided community halls are great, look at the communities. The government built community halls in all these regional centres. And what happened? They were unused and abandoned. Why? Because it wasn't the community hall that was important. It was everyone getting together that built the community that made the hall important. The pride of accomplishment. These values now more than ever are under attack as liberty is challenged domestically and internationally, and from forces of what I would consider genuine evil and barbarism around the world, if you look at countries and what's going on in the Middle East and so forth. Now, the forces of big government provide a powerful emotional narrative. We will ensure that you are secure, we'll ensure that you have jobs, we will ensure you're provided for, and we'll protect you from those nasty, scary people that look different. We all know, though, that big government can't do this. It's always failed when it's tried, and it's led to misery and despair. The allure and the temptation, however, remains. This allure has remained throughout human history, culminating in the graveyards of over 100 million souls that filled the 20th century, including my relatives in Russia. Or even today, when we see the famines in Venezuela as a result of these policies. As Karl Popper noted, those who promise us paradise on earth never produced anything but a hell. They have claimed and tried to drag down heaven and bring it to earth. In reality, they have dragged us down from the earth and into hell. And I mean, I say Venezuela, but like a couple of weeks ago, I was reading that they're bringing in forced labour camps there. They're actually bringing in slavery in socialist Utopia in Venezuela. It's not just, we laughed 6 months ago when they had toilet paper shortages and there were raids on people hoarding toilet paper. But just think about how horrific this is. And think about how horrific it was that we had Australian politicians and leaders in academia lining up and praising the people who brought so much death and destruction to their country. Something I want to note is that history is not a march for endless progress. We look at modern history now and we think everything gets better. Aren't things better than 100 years ago? Except look at where it hasn't happened. Argentina used to be one of the most prosperous countries in the world. The living standard the same as Australia. They then decided, hey, let's try big government. And look what happened there. The most chilling example I've been given, though, was where was the most liberal country, city in Europe in the 1920s? It was Berlin. Berlin in the 1920s was a bastion as this sort of bohemian, free-spirited culture. Look what happened just less than 10 years after that. It's not an endless march forward. And unless we start accepting the challenges and the problems that we have, I'm genuinely worried about the future. Now, here in Australia, I think we're experiencing a loss of belief in the human spirit and the values of liberty that have made us great. A loss of self-confidence in ourselves and in our values, and the rise once again of these discredited ideologies. Big government regulation is crushing businesses. We discussed it earlier today about the regulation. $15,000 on every worker. Taxes are hurting families. The fact that fundamental concepts like freedom of speech are under attack. Just think about just how it is where a student, an 18-year-old student at the Queensland University of Technology could make a joke on Facebook about how he was refused entry into a computer lab and he's facing $200,000 in fines. I'm sorry, Australia in the 21st century, and this is taken for granted? An 18-year-old student facing $200,000 in fines for a joke on Facebook, and it's been spent over 2 years hauled before the courts. It's estimated in the US that an average citizen commits 3 felonies a day. Two scholars actually in a book called 3 Felonies a Day, Silverdale and Dershowitz, demonstrated in the US how this occurs. English common law tradition has gone out the window. So we've seen this crisis of self-confidence in the West and loss of belief in our society. A self-perpetuating cycle, in fact. And what do we see from our politicians and our political leaders? Despite all the gains we've made, despite all the progress we are losing. Just look at the lead up to the federal election. In the first half of the election campaign, just the first half, the Liberal government made 95 micro-announcements for $1.3 billion in taxpayer money going to marginal seats for projects like new football club change rooms, netball courts, fixing mobile phone problems. You ask a politician now, so what do you think about core issues like freedom of speech? And they'll go, new football stadium, look what we've built here. You ask about a budget deficit and you get told about a new road. And this is on the Liberal side, who are meant to believe in small government. We see things like $10,000 for Tinder for dogs of taxpayer money, $680,000 of your money spent designing a coffee cup by a department, $20,000 of our money going on experimental poetry sessions for public servants. We laugh. You just laughed. These are real costs that people pay for. These are things that people work hard, people are struggling with, and this is where their money are going. And how is there no outrage about this? It's not funny, it is morally repugnant that people work hard to have their money treated this way. How is the fact that we have corporate scandals, but the fact that taxpayer money is being used to influence elections, to bribe marginal seats, not a scandal? How is pork barrelling not corruption? If you take money from a company, you go to jail. But if you take money from everyone, you use it to win 2 election seats, and hey, you're on a parliamentary pension. So the question is why? And then what can we do about it? Will Wilkinson, a US writer, who I generally disagree with on a lot of issues, but he is from our side of politics, He works for the US-based Scanning Center. He recently wrote a paper 2 days ago arguing, well, we actually can't do that much, and he admitted defeat. I would strongly urge everybody to read this, because while I strongly disagree with Will on many issues, this is an article that's required reading, I think, although I disagree with his conclusions. What he cited, and he started his argument with, was Wagner's law, which is as an economy's per capita output grows larger over time, government spending consumes a larger share of that output. He's right. You look at every single country around the world, and the more prosperous a country is, the bigger the government becomes. For those of us who argue that small government is what's required for economic growth, this is a challenge. As he says, and I quote, "The fact of the matter is that our well-funded and well-organised attempts to convince voters to reduce their demand for the services financed by federal spending so far have all failed. It's time to consider the possibility that there is no convincing them." He goes on, "Folks on the right need to consider the possibility that we've been wrong to see demand for government as the sort of dependent variable that can be manipulated through education or propaganda or political organising or too clever by heart fiscal policy gymnastics or constitutional amendments. The only variable the level of government spending clearly and reliably responds to over the long run is GDP per capita, and the relationship goes the wrong way. When people get richer, they want more welfare state. You can want Americans to get continuously wealthier and also want the government to consume a smaller share of the national economic output, but there's very little reason to think you can have both of these things. That is what the world is telling us." And he concludes that essentially we need to give up on reducing the size of government, and we need to focus our energy on, quote, "removing regulatory barriers to economic participation, innovation and growth." I disagree with him on the outcome and his policy proposals, but I do agree with him on the fact that what we are doing is clearly not working. It hasn't worked in Australia, where despite Howard, despite our best efforts, despite all the best politicians, government grows. Government grew under Thatcher, probably one of the best leader of the 20th century anywhere in the world. The only other exception being perhaps Reagan. The only other potential best leader being Reagan. Government also grew. That's kind of a problem for our side. If we're saying you can put the best possible person into a job and we still get the opposite outcome, we need to reevaluate. An alternative view recently came from Theresa May. Theresa May, leader of the UK Conservative Party, British Prime Minister now as well as leader of the Conservative Party, in a speech last week, rejected the Hayekian notion of markets as a discovery process. She argued that governments can't be just, quote, sitting back and seeing what happens, argued that the government's role is to choose winners, and that it's important to have worker direction of companies with mandated union and worker positions on company boards. Bit of a departure from Thatcher, but that's one of the world's major conservative leaders today. Tony Abbott, as John stole some of my thunder about in Q&A earlier, said in an article concerning Theresa May's speech, and I quote, "Maybe, just maybe, it's time for the sensible right to abandon the Reaganite doctrine that government is the problem, not the solution, and to start really believing in the good that government can do." Is this the state of conservative politics at the moment? I would argue that there is another solution. There is a solution which is not the defeatism of Will Wilkinson, but it is not the embrace of big government conservatism and a return to the sort of Disraeli Chamberlain model of the past. Clearly, we are doing something wrong, and people are yearning for something different. What we need to do, however, is first of all recognise why, and then recognise and come up with a strategy as to how to change. I am sick to death of people on our side of politics blaming the media, blaming the ABC, blaming the public servants, blaming anyone but ourselves for this mess. Because I argue that if we believe in personal responsibility, we need to believe in our responsibility for the failures we have at the moment. People are yearning for something. The political class has failed. The question is, can we provide an alternative? What we need to do firstly is create a new vision and then demonstrate it. Demonstrate an emotional narrative. when we generally make arguments, we make them based on rational things and GDP. Oh, if we have this policy where we'll have productivity enhancements, GDP growth, and marginal increases in output. This is how we normally prosecute arguments, and it's absolutely useless because 98% of the population, and those of us who aren't in this room, are swayed by emotion and not by reason. People are not convinced on issues of trade when we say, well, you know what, you're going to lose your job because of this trade agreement, but ultimately, you know, if you do the numbers, everyone is going to be better off in the long term. That's a little supper for somebody who's lost their job. If we talk about, you know, new technologies are wonderful, look at Uber and the blockchain, because that's out of the cosmopolitan elite, no one will care. What we need to do is create a meta-narrative that people emotionally embrace and attach themselves to. One that taps into the Australian psyche, our spirit of self-reliance, the factors that made us great, that resonates with people and shows a positive vision for the future. So what is this? How do we do it? So, and there are a few steps on this. The first thing is how we talk to people. The biggest problem that I see is that we don't recognise people's values. We talk at them, not to them. One of the best books of the last couple of years that I think is a must-read for anyone in politics is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. Jonathan Haidt, who is a moral philosopher in the United States, wrote this book and curiously started writing this book as a leftist. By the time he concluded writing it, he was much more on our side. But what he talks about is that everyone has various and different moral values, things they care about. Generally, conservatives care about, you know, X values, liberals care about these, and leftists care about these. Unless we couch our arguments in terms that other people understand and it resonates with their moral values, we're not going to win. And a good example, though, of something we can do on a very simple level is what was told to me, is the fact that most of us don't even understand the arguments of those fighting us. If you want a good challenge, write an article advocating for a position you don't agree with, and see if you can do it work. There was a great Brian Kaplan, who's a good free market economist at George Mason University, once challenged Paul Krugman to what he called an ideological Turing test. So I'm assuming you all know the Turing test. You get if you get an artificial intelligence that somebody can't tell if they're an AI or a human, it passes. What he requested that people do is you write articles that you agree with and you don't, and it's the opposite of what you believe in. You put them up and you see if people, without knowing which is which, can tell the difference. This is a wonderful intellectual trick that I think we should start engaging in. We've had great communicators in Australia, which one of the greatest is Bert Kelly. Many people don't know who Bert Kelly is anymore, but he was one of the most influential people in Australian history, I would argue. I mean, he revolutionised public policy in Australia. He was responsible for the new right. Gough Whitlam, not somebody I would normally quote, said no private member has had as much influence in changing a major policy of the major parties. Bert was a farmer. He was passionately opposed to our trade policy at the time because it created a situation in which government granted favours and there was patronage, and he thought it was wrong because it created these unfair outcomes. Some were greatly enriched at the expense of others. He fought this in two ways: through humour, through satire, and through resonating with people. On one hand, and secondly, by showing a positive vision of the world of the future. A positive vision is what we need and is what we are lacking. Going back to my original point, when our enemies provide a view where the government will look after you from cradle to grave, if we attack the economics of it, we will never succeed. What we need to do is create an alternative vision. So what is this vision? People feel like government has failed them. We see this in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Europe, and in Australia. The rise of minor parties, the rise of UKIP and Nigel Farage, the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of One Nation, the rise of the evil fascist cup and communist parties in Europe. Things will only get worse. Because people will think, well, the system has failed us. We're hurting. Here's something that is different. One thing I actually agree with Tony Abbott when he was commenting favourably on Theresa May's speech was he said, quote, Britain's new PM is not the first mainstream centre-right politician to wrestle with a pervasive mood that I'm doing it tough and no one is on my side. But I think she might be closer to a sensible response than anyone else. I obviously disagree that it's a sensible response, but it's right in that she is somebody who has tackled this issue. And this is the second thing that I think we do wrong. Because as much as we focus on reducing the size of government, we need to start focusing on the alternative. The left's argument that no one will care for you has cut through. Why? Because we haven't responded to it. We respond with an economic treatise rather than demonstrating that actually there's a much better way for you to be taken care of than a big government bureaucracy doing it. This is, and I think that those of us on our side need to focus on society as much as we do on government. And this is something that I've changed my mind on recently. A couple of years ago, there was a big debate in the US of the libertarian community with what was then termed thick libertarianism. This argued that libertarianism shouldn't only be about policies, but it should be about society. Now, I actually disagreed violently with the people promoting thick libertarianism because they generally promoted a rather contrary societal view to mine, but I agree with them now on principle. In order for what we want to be achieved, we need to create the society that we want. We need to start focusing on building civil society. We don't just need to write an essay on how a friendly society is better because when you provide charity and you provide welfare through civil society, the social bonds improve communities. There's less shirking and it's voluntary and it's better for people. We need to start acting upon this. And we need to start preaching this to people because this is a vision that we can share of a society where people are looked after. A society governed by norms and not rules and laws. A society which recognises the value of institutions. Now, there was a deliberate reason the left have torn down our institutions and our history. We see the term cultural Marxism now generally used as a punchline and a laughing stock. And most people who say it don't actually know what it means, which is really frustrating when they just call everything cultural Marxism. But the idea behind it is actually a solid one. It is one that if you destroy everything civil about society, then people are forced to rely on the government for everything. This is what we need to combat. After decades of the success of these policies, people need to realise, people now think rather, that there is nothing other than government that can be there for them, and we need to show them otherwise. Now, throughout history, the left sought to reshape man. Bad language, okay, gendered language, sorry. But build humankind up to their own personal vision. The dreams of these high modernists, as expressed in their greatest triumph, was an attempt to create a communist heaven on earth. This heaven on earth, as I said earlier, cannot be realised. Humans can never be perfected. The unconstrained vision of humanity, to quote Thomas Sowell, was shattered upon the rocks of the Gulag archipelago. The implications of this fact that we cannot perfect humankind or change human nature means that simply creating a small government state is insufficient. And this is a fact that some of our people fall into, as well as our opponents. If we create our perfect state, we will not have utopia. There will still be poverty. There will still be crime. There will still be people suffering. This is what we need to provide an alternative to. Now, we have an alternative to it. We have an alternative to it that is far better than the government micromanaged alternative. But unless we start realising, A, people are hurting at the moment, and B, our solutions will hurt more people, it's not going to be helpful. The milk debates are one at the moment. Now, I'm sorry, but this is something which I happen to quite like cheap milk, and I think it's good for consumers. I think that deregulation was a very good thing. If we go and approach somebody who's talking about farmer suicides because of milk deregulation with a, yeah, but it's actually, it's actually good for consumers, so we're not going to convince them. Once again, we need the alternative vision. We need to bring together this positive vision of society, but one in which we have an alternative. And our alternative is where we have the institutions that will help people and fill in the void that is currently in place. Where people once again have their rights and micromanaged by this paternalistic nanny state that tries to tell us what to do, but rather is guided by civil society. Now, we're trying to address this question, but I think the best analogy was a quote attributed to St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis, arguing theology, once said something along the lines of, preach the gospel wherever necessary. If really necessary, use words. Now, the entire idea behind this was you live the life that you want and you demonstrate what you want. You don't actually preach somebody by explicitly quoting to them. In the same way, if we want to promote our ideas, hitting someone over the head with a thick copy of Rothbard or Mises isn't actually going to convince anyone. What we need to do, once again, is live the life that we believe in, which means that charity institutions matter. One of the reasons, as people would know in the last week, with the tragic situation of Senator Boldane, a lot of people on our side of politics got together to raise money to repay his creditors, was because we believe in privately helping other people. This was people on our side putting our money where our mouths were to help people. I know the people that I'm friends with have tried to set up charities to help other people. This is what we need to talk about. So I know it may seem very pessimistic in Australia at the moment, or indeed anywhere in the world, but I'm not a pessimist. I think we're on the cusp of unprecedented prosperity if we only get the policy levers right. And as dark as things may now seem, I'm convinced that we actually can prevail. It'll be challenging, but by getting involved, firstly, and making a difference, whether it be through activism, politics, think tanks, media, and so forth, there's a chance to make a difference. But in addition to just getting involved, we need to make sure that we get involved in the right way and recognise our failures. We need to start thinking not in terms of policy papers, but in terms of providing an emotional vision for people. And we need to provide that alternative. People are desperate for this alternative. People have been failed by the current regime. They don't necessarily know, however, that our alternative is the only way they will be helped. What we need to do is talk less about raw data, more about our vision, and most of all, provide an alternative. And then, as Tim Wilson keeps saying, we'll have a future that'll be totally awesome. Thank you. Wants to ask me a question or disagree with me and tell me I'm wrong, I'm happy to take it, otherwise we can go and have another drink.
I'll jump in. I think the collapse of the Berlin Wall created a great crisis for our side of politics because we thought we'd won. The left, particularly the left in Australia, but I know internationally, sat back and said, look, we seem to have lost. What do we now do? What's the new strategy? And they were quite open about articulating their new strategies and put those in force. There were plenty of books written from the left about exactly what they were doing, and they've put a tremendous amount of those into action. And I've got to say, I think the crisis of, quote, our side of politics on this has been, well, what do we do now? We thought we'd won, but we got. And I've got to say to you that your comments just now have given me, I would have to say, the first time that I've heard someone turn around and confront the truth that we actually didn't win, and that it's an ongoing battle, and that we have to re-strategise, we have to refocus. And I was exceedingly pleased by your comments.
Yeah, thank you. Excellent mail for the question. But one of the problems is, I mean, I was at a free market economic conference recently, and pretty much everyone was simply resting on the laurels of Friedman, Coase, Buchanan, without anyone thinking about the future. I mean, I actually came back from free market, so have come back from some free market conferences, being more depressed about the state of things than before, because nobody actually addressed these issues. In terms of what the left have been doing, they've been very successful. They're not better than with universities. I genuinely think it will be better for somebody now not to go to university and be subjected to the degree of brainwashing that they have at the moment. And I'm actually really glad that in the US there are now alternatives out there. The Praxis institutions. Have a look at that if you're actually interested. Praxis, and has set up alternatives for people going to traditional university, sending people in the job market with on-the-job training, mentorship, grants programs. So people actually can learn skills rather than indoctrinating.
We do have that here.
No, sure, but the problem is that the people who actually go in Australia and go through that course generally are only a small subset of the population. Generally in Australia, for the most part, if you are somebody who finishes high school successfully with very high exit marks, you would go to university, and the chance of somebody who is less than 1% who doesn't. The people who go to apprenticeships are those who receive these programs are targeting the top 1%. Until the top 1%, there are alternatives out there. Now, I actually think universities can be a good thing, but look obviously, that we need to seriously start re-evaluating why our money is going on things that are creating values that aren't truth. Universities used to be about truth. I think if what you're looking at the moment in a lot of areas is they're about pursuing an agenda rather than pursuing truth. And going back, Jonathan Haidt at Heterodox Academy is a website you might want to have a look at. And it's actually one of the interesting things though is he's teamed up with Lenore Skenazy. However you pronounce her. Sorry, I always fail in this one. Her work has been a childhood. So the problems that young kids are so coddled by the state, that once they become 18, they have no sense of risk tolerance. They have no sense of being able to take personal responsibility because they've gone through the first 18 years of their lives being protected from making any particularly bad decision. This is something else that I actually think we need to look at. But the reason I mention this is the two go hand in hand. And if you look at the rise in various movements at a severe level, there's a strong relationship there. So that's something I would encourage people to pay attention to.
Hey, amazing speech, really great, and love the whole put your money where your mouth is type thing. I guess kind of question is, you kind of brought up the agenda thing about universities. Do you think there's a place for libertarians to kind of change academia or universities from the inside, or do you think that we should be more focusing on going into the private sphere, or putting our money into putting our effort into private institutions and kind of being in competition with academia?
In the United States, I think there's a good chance because there are a lot of private universities who rely on donors and who rely on benefactors, and you can actually put a lot of pressure on them to improve. So a good project in the US with the Heterodox Academy has been trying to get universities people who donate to universities not to keep giving money unless they actually start having a more unbiased syllabus. In Australia, we have a problem that all of our universities are run by the government. I'm not sure how we can deal with that. We have problems where faculties are self-identify as over 90% vote far left. This is a problem. How we change this, I honestly don't know. I mean, look, I remember, the story I always say jokingly was the fact that I was told my first year of economics, I was pulled aside by my tutor, who told me, Tim, you understand more about economics than anyone else here, but unless you start supporting Keynesianism, we're not going to pass you, quote, don't rock the boat, unquote. And it's even got worse since then. Now, I actually happen to think that the people who are most hurt by this are actually many people on the left, because we get our beliefs challenged. They don't. They just go through being spoon-fed something. So the fact that we actually have our beliefs challenged in some ways is actually a good thing. I know I'm grasping for silver linings here, but look, in Australia, reforming universities is something that, with the exception of a couple of good universities, sort of faculties and lecturers, RMIT, we've got the RMIT team at the back over there. I think that's going to be a challenge, and I don't have an easy answer.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Could I suggest that most of what you've said is true, but to put it in basic language that most people who are not at this conference could understand, is that you're talking nerd stuff.
Yes.
You know, the basic deal is you've got all this stuff and it's all nerd stuff. No one pays attention because they're already at the back page.
Yes.
Right? And the reality of it is that it's not universities. It's currently in this state of Victoria, it's 3- and 4-year-olds that are being indoctrinated by the state. And where is it that we have a comedian who stands up and takes the piss out of Labor instead of us?
Neil Colhacker.
Yes, and
Here's one. We're trying to get him for our event.
and that's
Still
good.
sad, right?
But how often is he on YouTube? How often is he on anywhere? And you know, where's he on?
No, you're right. So
What the young people want.
So what do we do about it?
Yeah,
The question.
Well, you can't have me up there saying Australianism all the time, but nevertheless, and that's, I take one other exception, is I am an Australian. Before I'm anything else, then I'm a Victorian. and so I don't have any problem with nationalism. Only the people who think that it was all the downfall of Europe. Well,
Oh, sure. No.
Well,
Patriotism is the thing, right? And when I said nationalism, I meant it in the context of European sort of
we've already said them a couple of times. Haven't we?
sort of, you know, I meant that in the context of the various, other parties around the world. I certainly I didn't mean it in that way. Anyone else want to disagree with me on something? Or Malcolm, what are you going to tell me I'm wrong about?
I don't want to disagree with you. No, but I can see in the context of your speech that medical services could be completely provided by the private sector, with the government looking after people that can't afford to manage it, but that is just not the way the cards have been dealt in this country or anywhere around the world. So I can't see, but I just can't see how we can move from a state-based system to a...
Easy. What you do is you replace first of all, you make Medicare. There's actually a very good plan that John Humphreys came up to deal with this, and he's much better at articulating it than I am. But the way that you do it is, for A, you make the Medicare levy reflect the actual cost of Medicare. So at the moment, people think Medicare is cheap because the Medicare levy is 1.5%. The Medicare actually costs about 12%. So one, you actually remove the line. Point two, you change the system to a voucher, which is equivalent to it. So you have, over the next 10 years, you have exactly the same program, but rather than it being provided by the taxpayer, there's a voucher. Point three, you allow the voucher to be used either for Medicare or for a private company that will give you the same services. Point four, everybody starts moving to the private companies that provide you with a better service and moving away from Medicare and that. So that's essentially the 20-year plan as to how you build a better health system. Glad I fixed that for you.
Tim, a few years ago, I got an invite to a half-day conference in Washington with the Americans for Tax Reform with a network of people from the United States on industrial relations, who were supposed to be industrial relations specialists. And you said to me, Ken, don't go, because no one's going to pay you way. There's nothing big out of it, and it's really not going to be.
I remember this conversation.
Right? And so I went. And
I'm not the most persuasive person.
and there was one person, there was probably about 40 in the workshop. There was one person there, and I walked away, and the whole trip was worth it for this one person. Because this person was a ex-Republican House rep who was doing work reforming superannuation schemes across the United States, public superannuation schemes. Going from state to state, you had some high-wealth individual who was paying to do this. His point was, if you're going to do reform, you have to be specific. You have to know exactly what you're out to do. And the key thing that you have to do is work with the politicians to make that reform a success for that politician.
Yes.
And if you don't do that, don't even bother talking about the reform. And if we're going to do something, and that was a big lesson for me, and the work I do is directed by that. If we're going to achieve stuff, we have to be after very specific targets. Don't waffle. We've got to go for very specific reforms, and the politicians are so time poor that on each issue that we seek to go on, we have to hold them by the hand and help them make it a political success for
Absolutely.
them.
Politicians respond to incentives. I mean, this is basic public choice theory. One of the reasons behind the ATA has been to provide cover for politicians to do the right thing, to praise them, to sort of scold them when they're wrong. It's like, you know, with little children, no, bad politician, bad minister. But to actually be able to build that up. Some of the most successful campaigns have been those where, actually, no, I'm not going to mention that because the camera's on. But look, basically, you're absolutely right. What you need to do is provide that level of support for political figures and to make a culture where their incentives are such as to do the right thing. At the moment, politicians have an incentive structure which very often leads to them trying to buy votes off, them trying to spend money. What we need to do is create an incentive structure where politicians try and do the right thing. On that note, I think I'll stop rambling. And thank you so much for coming. I hope you have a good night. There's more food here, so please enjoy.